We're all here because we're committed to the biggest question of all. What's out there?
There is a version of history in the settled systems that almost everyone accepts. It says that terrormorphs are a fact of life on the frontier. Dangerous, yes. Terrifying, certainly. But ultimately, no different from a storm or a tidal surge or the hard radiation that bleeds through insufficiently shielded hulls. Natural, inevitable. One of the prices you pay for living beyond the inner planets, for staking a claim on a world the universe never agreed to give you. It's a tidy explanation, and like most tidy explanations, it asks you not to look too closely at the edges, because when you do look, when you actually sit with the records, the research logs, the survival testimonies, the things the United Colonies never officially denied but never quite confirmed, a different story takes shape. One that isn't about monsters at all. One that is about knowledge and what institutions do when they have knowledge that could save lives but cannot, for reasons of pride or strategy or raw political convenience, afford to share it. The Terrormorphs didn't simply appear from the void. They were encountered up close, at catastrophic cost, and then they were studied. And somewhere between that first encounter and the decades of destruction that followed, someone in a position of authority looked at what they knew and decided that the people most at risk deserved to know very little of it. That is the question that sits at the heart of everything that follows. Not what terrormorphs are exactly, though that matters deeply. Not even what happened to Londinion, though that wound runs through this entire story, like a fault line. The question is simpler and more unsettling than either of those. What did the United Colonies know about terrormorphs? When did they know it? And what choices did they make with that knowledge while frontier settlers kept dying? That question has no clean answer, but the shape of it, the outline of it, tells us everything. You have to understand what a terrormorph actually is before you can understand why the response to it feels so disproportionate, so strange, so quietly outrageous. Not in the abstracted clinical sense of understanding, not as a category or a threat level, but in the visceral, immediate sense of what it means to share a world with something like this. Their scientific designation is Oxycio Machina, a name that translates, roughly, as killing machine. And whatever the researchers who assigned it were feeling when they wrote it down, they were not being dramatic. Terrormorphs are large. That is the first thing, and it matters, because large predators in human history have always occupied a specific psychological category. Bears, lions, crocodiles, where the danger is obvious and comprehensible. You see something that size, and your body understands the math. But terrormorphs are large the way a consequence is large. They don't fit neatly into the mental space you prepare for danger. They are the biological endpoint of something that nature or circumstance or something else entirely sharpened into the specific shape of a killing machine. And when you stand in front of one, what you feel is not just fear. It's a kind of cognitive disruption, like the world has rearranged itself into a configuration it wasn't supposed to allow. They are fast in a way their size makes implausible. They are durable in a way that makes conventional defensive measures feel ceremonial rather than practical. Their physiology is deeply strange. Armored in sections, mobile in ways that contradict their apparent weight, capable of absorbing damage that would end most large organisms and continuing to function. Vanguard field reports describe encounters where multiple armed personnel with military-grade equipment engaged a single Terrormorph and found themselves losing ground. This is not a failure of courage or training. It is an encounter with something built, by whatever process built it, to be very difficult to kill. They also emit pheromones that cause extreme psychosis in human beings who are exposed long enough. This detail tends to get buried in the broader terror of what the creature is, but it matters because it means that a sustained encounter with a Terrormorph degrades not just your body, but your capacity to make decisions. The creature does not only attack you, it makes it harder for you to think clearly about being attacked. But here is where the story gets strange. Because Terrormorphs, as most people in the settled systems understand them, are only half the picture. The first documented encounter with one occurred sometime in the early 22s on a remote moon, a single creature that slaughtered most of a team of astrogeologists before being brought down by 8 UC Marines, 6 of whom did not survive. That encounter produced a classification, a threat level, and a name. What it did not produce for a very long time afterward was the most important piece of biological information about this creature: where it comes from. The life cycle of the Terrormorph was not publicly understood until 2330, the present day of the settled systems, by which point the creature had already been killing settlers for over a century. The reason for that gap is the core of everything this story is about. Terrormorphs begin as something called heatleeches, small creatures, almost negligible in appearance, parasitic organisms that hitch rides on human ships, concealing themselves in the cargo holds and atmospheric systems of vessels moving between worlds. They are found throughout the settled systems and are considered a nuisance more than a threat. What was not publicly known, what was suppressed or overlooked or buried under the weight of institutional interest, is that heatleeches are not a separate species. They are the juvenile form of the Terrormorph. They are the egg stage of Oxycio machina. A heatleech that reaches a settled world will mature over the course of years into a full Terrormorph. The timeline is slow enough to obscure the connection. A colony is established. Heatleeches arrive undetected on the ships that built it. Years pass. The colony grows. And then, one day, something emerges from the landscape that no one shipped there and no one can explain. The creature was there all along, in a form too small to notice. By the time it reveals itself, the damage is already irreversible. There is also a second accelerant, a plant that grows on Toliman II called the Lazarus plant, whose spores can trigger the metamorphosis from heatleech to Terrormorph almost instantaneously. A heatleech that contacts the Lazarus plant's bloom does not need years to mature. It transforms in minutes. What this means, in terms of how concentrated and rapid a Terrormorph outbreak can be, is almost too alarming to hold steadily in mind. The Lazarus plant turns a slow, diffuse threat into something capable of overwhelming a settlement before it has time to respond. The first confirmed encounters with Terrormorphs didn't come with any of this context. Early frontier settlers who encountered the creature didn't recognize it as the endpoint of a life cycle they were participating in every time a ship docked at a new colony. It was simply a threat, categorized alongside the general category of hostile fauna that any planetary settlement had to account for. The early reports used different names, different physical descriptions, different assessments of behavior. It took time and more deaths than it should have before the pattern was identified, before the encounters were understood to be encounters with the same creature, before the scale of the problem was aggregated into something anyone in authority could look at and see clearly. By the time Terrormorphs were formally categorized and studied, they had already been killing settlers for years, and at least some of the people who studied them most closely understood things about their biology that they did not see fit to share. The mechanism of their spread is worth sitting with because it explains a feature of the Terrormorph crisis that otherwise seems almost supernatural, the way the creatures appear on worlds that have been settled for decades, as if they emerged from the land itself, as if the planet conjured them. Heatleeches are not native to most of the worlds where Terrormorphs eventually appear. They travel aboard ships, in cargo holds, in atmospheric ducting, in the compressed spaces of vessels moving between systems carrying colonists and equipment and supplies. They are small enough and inconspicuous enough to go undetected through most standard inspections. A colony world receives ships for years before its first Terrormorph appears, and by that time, no one thinks to trace the creature back to the cargo manifest of a vessel that docked a decade earlier. The timeline varies depending on the Lazarus plant's presence or absence. On a world without the plant, maturation is slow, measured in years, sometimes many years. The threat reveals itself gradually, which gives it time to establish before anyone fully understands what they are dealing with. On a world where the Lazarus plant spores find their way to heatleeches, whether through natural spread from Toliman II's ecosystem, or through deliberate introduction, as Vae Victis would demonstrate is possible, the timeline collapses entirely. An outbreak becomes possible not in years, but in minutes. The slow, patient spread of a pest becomes an immediate catastrophe. This is why the discovery in Londinion's ruins, watching a heatleech contact a blooming Lazarus plant and transform, carries the weight it does for everyone who witnesses it. It changes the threat assessment for every settled world, retroactively and permanently. Londinion sits in the memory of the settled systems the way certain events always sit, not as something people analyze exactly, but as a reference point, a shorthand for catastrophe. You say the name in certain company, and you don't need to explain what you mean. The word itself carries the weight. But the shorthand, like most shorthands, has smoothed away the texture of the thing, the specificity of it, the particular human reality of what Londinion was before it became a symbol. The colony on Toliman II in the Toliman system was not primarily an expansion effort in the peacetime sense of the word. It was built during the Colony War, founded as a major supply depot for the United Colonies war effort, a hub for the industrial throughput that large-scale conflict demands. It was a logistics colony In other words, a place where the machinery of war was fed and organized and sent back out to the frontier where it was needed. That context matters because it means Londinion was not a quiet outpost far from the institutions of power. It was actively connected to those institutions, serving their immediate military needs and under their direct operational awareness. And it was at the same time the central hub for Aceles processing during the Colony War. The Aceles is a large creature native to the region, and it is, as it turns out, the natural predator of the Terrormorph. Where Aceles populations are healthy, Terrormorph populations are suppressed. The relationship is not complicated. It is the ancient, effective logic of a food chain doing what food chains do. Where the predator thrives, the prey is kept in check. Where the predator is absent, the prey expands without limit into the space that absence creates. During the Colony War, the United Colonies ran short on synthetic food supplies. The Aceles, large and available, became a replacement food source. Londinion was where they were processed, slaughtered, and distributed to feed UC forces at scale. The decision to use the Aceles this way was, from a purely logistical standpoint, rational. There was a war on. There was a food shortage. There was a large and available animal. The decision was made. What this decision did to the ecosystem of Toliman II was catastrophic, though the word catastrophic was not the one anyone used at the time. The Aceles population was driven toward extinction. The creature that had kept the heatleech population in check, and by extension, the Terrormorph population that those heatleeches would eventually become, was systematically removed from the landscape by the same government that would later mourn the colony it helped destroy. By the time the worst Terrormorph outbreak in recorded history struck Londinion, the check that nature had already provided for this exact threat had been eaten. What grew in Londinion before the fall was a genuine community. The supply hub had the texture of any human settlement. Routines, relationships, the slow accumulation of shared life that makes a place feel like somewhere rather than nowhere. The kind of settlement that, given time and peace, might have become permanent, might have become home. But the Colony War's end did not bring peace to Toliman II. It brought the consequences of what the war had done to the planet's ecology. The attack, when it came, was overwhelming. An enormous swarm of Terrormorphs struck the city, and the UC's defenses failed with a speed that spoke to how completely unprepared the colony was for the scale of what arrived. There was no gradual escalation. There was a threshold, and then there wasn't a colony. And here is where the Admiral enters the story. Fleet Admiral François Sanon, known by the epithet Vae Victis, Latin for woe to the vanquished, was one of the UC's most feared military commanders during the Colony War. When the Terrormorph outbreak overwhelmed Londinion, he was faced with a decision of staggering stakes. If Terrormorphs escaped Toliman II aboard evacuating ships, the heatleeches, already spreading through the settled systems, would have company far more dangerous than anything humans had yet encountered. The outbreak could not be allowed to leave the planet. So he bombed the spaceport, not the city, the spaceport specifically, which cut off evacuation and sealed the colony's fate. Countless residents who might otherwise have escaped were condemned to remain behind with the Terrormorphs. Sanon's calculation was utilitarian to the point of being monstrous. The deaths of Londinion civilians against the potential deaths of settlers across dozens of other worlds if the outbreak spread. He made the calculation, and he acted on it. What the official record does not emphasize, what the emergency recordings discovered in Londinion's ruins would later reveal, is that Sanon already knew about the connection between heatleeches and the Lazarus plant before he gave the order. He understood the mechanism. He understood how the outbreak had happened, and he understood what it meant for every settled world where heatleeches had already arrived. And he kept that knowledge to himself. After the colony war ended in 2311, the Freestar Collective demanded that the UC place its active commanders on trial for war crimes. Sanon was found guilty, sentenced to death, and officially executed. Except he wasn't. The UC leadership considered him too valuable an asset to actually lose. His execution was staged. He was secretly imprisoned in a facility beneath the mast building in New Atlantis, subsection 7, where he continued to serve as a military advisor, using his knowledge of colony war-era criminals to help the UC hunt them down. The state that tried him for murder kept him alive in the dark, because power rarely disposes of useful things. This matters not just as a footnote about institutional hypocrisy, though it is certainly that. It matters because Sanon, Vae Victis, is also the genetic template of Hadrian Sanon, the scientist at the center of the 2330 Terrormorph investigation. And it matters because, from his cell beneath New Atlantis, he continued to pull strings that would lead directly to the Terrormorph attacks that open the story of the settled systems in the present day. The research into Terrormorphs that occurred in the years surrounding Londinion tells a story about institutional priorities that is hard to look at directly because it is not dramatic. It does not involve destruction of evidence or shouted orders in shadowed rooms. It involves something quieter and, in many ways, harder to hold anyone accountable for: the management of knowledge by people who understood that knowledge differently than the people dying would have understood it, and who had strong institutional reasons to keep that difference intact. The United Colonies Xeno-Warfare Division experimented during the Colony War with trying to turn Terrormorphs into weapons. This is not a theory or an inference. It is confirmed in the records. The UC looked at Oxycio Machina, this creature of almost incomprehensible lethality, and saw a potential instrument of war. The effort to understand the Terrormorph was never purely defensive. It was, from at least one significant institutional angle, an attempt to understand how to use it. This matters for what came after, because if you have been thinking about the Terrormorph as a potential weapon, if your research apparatus has been asking questions about how to control or direct the creature's behavior, then the public revelation of everything you know about that creature becomes a complicated proposition. Not just because it might reveal the weaponization angle, but because it might reveal how much you understood about the creature's life cycle, and how long you understood it, and what you chose to do with that understanding while settlements were dying. The Lazarus plant is the linchpin of this. The connection between the plant's spores and the accelerated metamorphosis of heatleeches into Terrormorphs was known before the fall of Londinion, known, at minimum, to Sanon, and plausibly to others within the UC's research apparatus. What Sanon did with that knowledge was keep it. He covered it up when he bombed the spaceport, turning the bombing itself into a mechanism of suppression. The destruction of the colony's communications infrastructure meant that whatever records existed of the heat leech research on Toliman II were buried under ice and rubble. The ruins of Londinion in this reading are not just a monument to a disaster, they are a vault. And the knowledge locked inside that vault remained inaccessible to the broader public for nearly 2 decades. When the Vanguard investigation of 2330 finally makes its way into the ruins of Londinion, when the emergency recordings begin to play in the dead control room of a spaceport that was bombed from orbit, the weight of what is heard is not just about a decision made during a crisis. It is about what that decision protected and for how long and at whose expense. The cover here, and this is worth sitting with, was not maintained by a single bad actor. It was maintained by the ordinary momentum of institutions that benefit from certain facts remaining obscure. The UC never publicly lied about terrormorphs in any single provable statement. It simply never corrected what wasn't known. The heat leech connection wasn't suppressed through an explicit order after Londinion. It was left buried, and the burial was never disturbed because no one with the access and the motivation to disturb it had done so until now. The people living on frontier worlds, finding terrormorphs appearing where there should have been none, had no way to understand that they were looking at the adult form of a creature that had already been aboard their ships. No way to understand that the spores of a plant growing in the ruins of a dead colony could turn a minor pest into an extinction-level threat for a settlement. And no way to understand that someone who once held the highest ranks in UC military command had known all of this, kept it, and used it. Because that is what Vae Victis did in 2330. From his cell in subsection 7, drawing on the knowledge he had hoarded for decades, he deployed Lazarus plant pollen beyond the confines of Londinion, cultivating it in civilian areas, deliberately triggering terrormorph transformations in populated regions, timing an attack on New Atlantis itself to coincide with a pivotal moment in UC political proceedings. The terrormorphs that struck New Atlantis were not a natural occurrence. They were a message. Written by a man the UC had officially told the world was dead, using knowledge the UC had officially told the world was unknown. The United Colonies Vanguard is presented to potential recruits as the most direct path to UC citizenship for those born without it. Service in exchange for belonging. Danger in exchange for standing. It's a clean transaction, and it appeals to exactly the kind of person who has both ambition and the willingness to put their body between a threat and something worth protecting. The defensive function is real. Vanguard patrols do protect frontier settlements. Vanguard personnel do respond to terrormorph incursions at considerable personal risk, and the courage involved in that work is not diminished by anything else the institution does. These are people who walk toward the thing that everyone else is running from, with equipment that is frequently inadequate for the encounter they're about to have. The field casualties in Vanguard operations against terrormorphs tell a story about the gap between what the UC publicly acknowledges about the threat and what the people it sends to address that threat actually face. The numbers are not widely published. They don't need to be suppressed. They simply don't find their way into the kind of visibility that generates public conversation. But the Vanguard is also a mechanism for the management of uncomfortable information. The investigations it sends personnel to conduct, the sites they are asked to assess, the records they file, all of it passes through institutional processes before it shapes the public understanding of anything. What gets emphasized is what gets decided is worth emphasizing. Field agents who have followed the Terrormorph thread with particular persistence have sometimes found themselves, at the conclusion of those investigations, redirected, not punished. The UC is too sophisticated for the kind of retaliation that could be identified and named, but moved away from the thread they were pulling. SysDef, the UC system's defense, operates in an adjacent space, concerned with security threats to the political stability of the UC itself. A population that understood the full scope of what had happened with Terrormorphs, that the creature spreading across the settled systems was the adult form of a common pest, that a plant in the ruins of Londinion could turn that pest into an instant apocalypse, that an admiral officially executed for war crimes was actually alive in a basement advising the government that sentenced him, would be a population with questions that the UC's leadership apparatus was not designed to welcome. The management of that potential is not separate from SysDef's function. It is, in a real sense, part of it. The settlers on the frontier exist in a specific political position within the UC's hierarchy. They are valuable because expansion requires people willing to live on the edge of the map, to turn raw planetary environments into productive assets, to extend the effective reach of the UC across distances that its core military cannot fully cover. And they are peripheral because the political weight of a frontier colony, the representation, the capacity to generate meaningful pressure on institutions is small compared to the weight of the inner systems and New Atlantis. This is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No one sat in a room and decided frontier settlers were expendable. It's what happens when the people making decisions about a crisis are sufficiently insulated from its consequences. The UC cabinet assessing the Terrormorph situation does not live on Toliman II. The advisors who have the full picture of the heatleech life cycle are not the ones who hear the sound of something arriving outside their settlement in the dark. The gap between where the knowledge lives and where the danger lives is where the secret war is fought, not with weapons, but with policy, with protocol, with the managed distance between what is known and what is told. François Sanon occupies a uniquely uncomfortable position in all of this. She is, in the literal biological sense, a female clone of Vae Victis. His genetic template, raised without knowing who her original was, committed to science and to the UC's defense in a way that reads, in retrospect, like an almost deliberate counterpoint to everything her progenitor represented. She was, by her own account, aware that her father had been executed for war crimes. What she was not aware of, what the UC had carefully ensured she would not be aware of, is that he was still alive, and that the terrorist attacks she was investigating were his doing. The investigation places the player as a new Vanguard recruit in the position of carrying that knowledge, of knowing who Vae Victis is, and watching the person who has the most right to know work alongside them without it. The institutional structure of the Vanguard is not designed to support the decision to tell her, but the moral structure of what has happened, of what Sanon knew and kept, of what the UC has maintained and protected, of what the people of Londinion were never allowed to know, points somewhere else entirely. The Aceles, once you understand what happened to it, is not a creature that belongs in a story about natural disaster. It belongs in a story about institutional decision-making and its costs. In environments where Aceles populations are healthy, Terrormorph populations are suppressed. That relationship was not a discovery made in 2330. It was an observable ecological fact in the period before the Colony War. Where the predator lived, the prey was kept in check. What the Colony War did to that balance, through the specific decision to use the Aceles as a food source during wartime supply shortages, was remove the only naturally functioning mechanism for controlling the Terrormorph threat across the entire region where Londinion was built. The colony that was destroyed by Terrormorphs was, in the most direct possible sense, also the colony that processed the predator that would have kept those Terrormorphs from reaching critical population levels. Londinion processed Aceles. Londinion was then destroyed by what the Aceles kept in check. The circularity of this is not an irony that appears in any official commemoration of the tragedy. The UC Xeno-warfare program, which had been experimenting with Terrormorphs as potential weapons during the Colony War, provides a different lens on why the Aceles solution might have been considered less useful than a direct biological agent. This is worth sitting with carefully because it moves us from established fact into the territory of inference. But the inference is grounded. A creature you cannot control is a poor weapon. An Aceles population, once reintroduced to a biome, follows ecological logic rather than military orders. It doesn't stop where you tell it to stop. If you have been thinking about Terrormorphs as potential instruments of war, which the UC's Xeno-warfare division demonstrably was, then a solution that kills Terrormorphs directly is considerably more attractive than a solution that simply counterweights them with another large predator you also can't control. The logic here is not stated explicitly in any record, but it rhymes with everything else the UC's institutional priorities produced during this period. The choice that the Vanguard investigation ultimately places before you is between two remediation approaches: reintroduce the Aceles, breed them, re-establish them in the biomes where Terrormorphs are active, let nature do what it did before the war, stripped it of the means to do so, or deploy an engineered microbe, a pathogen specifically designed to target the heat leech and Terrormorph life cycle and eliminate it. The microbe works faster. It is more total in its effect. It carries with it a small but real risk of mutation and unintended consequences. The Aceles works slower, re-establishes something that was always supposed to be there, and carries its own complications. Large predators reintroduced to settled environments don't respect the boundaries of settled environments. Percival, the scientist on the team, prefers the microbe. Hadrian, who understands what happened to the Aceles, tends toward the ecological solution. Your vote is the deciding one, and by the time you cast it, everything you have learned about how the Aceles were lost, and why, and at what cost, has changed what the choice means. You are not choosing a pest control strategy. You are deciding whether to restore something that should never have been taken or to replace it with something manufactured, and in that replacement, whether to leave behind any trace of accountability for what the taking cost. There is a pattern in the Terrormorph story that reaches further than the specific decisions of specific people, further than Sanon's cover-up, further than the xeno-warfare program, further even than the particular politics of the colony war. It is a pattern about how human expansion processes the worlds it enters and what it leaves behind when it moves on. The frontier, in the language of the United Colonies, is always framed as territory to be claimed, developed, made productive. The problems of frontier worlds are engineering problems, solvable with the right resources, the right technology, the right human commitment. This framing is not irrational. Human settlement has survived and built and persisted across dozens of worlds by treating challenges as engineering challenges, but it carries in its structure a systematic tendency to undervalue the ways that settled worlds have already organized themselves. The food chains that exist before arrival, the relationships between organisms that have been balancing populations for longer than human beings have been a species, the natural checks that function without anyone designing them, maintaining equilibria that engineering, for all its ingenuity, has rarely been able to improve on. The Aceles and the heatleech were in balance before the colony war. That balance was not designed by anyone. It was not administered or monitored or maintained by an institution. It simply was. The accumulated outcome of ecological pressures operating over timescales that make human history look brief. The decision to eat the Aceles, made under wartime pressure and logistical necessity, was made without a full accounting of what the Aceles was actually doing in the ecosystem. The people who made that decision almost certainly did not know. The research that might have told them was not the kind of research the wartime UC was prioritizing. What this means, and this is where the story asks something of us beyond just assigning blame, is that Londinion was not only a failure of a specific admiral's choices, or of a specific research program's silence, or of the particular institutional culture that kept Sanon alive and his knowledge buried. It was also a failure of how expansion itself approaches the question of what it is doing to the places it enters. Every world that heatleeches have spread to, which by 2033 is most of the settled frontier, carries terrormorphs in waiting. The quiet common pest aboard the cargo ships, the thing everyone dismisses as a nuisance, is the next Londinion on a timeline nobody has calculated. The Freestar Collective, living at the frontier on its own terms, has developed a different relationship with this reality. Collective settlers talk about frontier threats in ways that UC documentation rarely captures. Granular, specific, passed down rather than filed upward. The kinds of knowledge that don't meet institutional standards for evidence but have nonetheless kept people alive in places where official systems were slow or absent. Whether that practical ecological literacy would have made a difference on Toliman II is something we can't know, but it represents an approach to the frontier that starts from a different premise, that the world you're entering has already been arranged in ways that matter, and that understanding that arrangement is not optional. The House of Varun's theology positions itself around the Great Serpent, a force of incomprehensible scale that does not recognize human designs as having special claim on the universe. There is something in that orientation that rhymes uncomfortably with what the Terrormorph represents. Not a threat to be solved with engineering, but a consequence to be understood, arriving with terrible patience in exactly the spaces that human decision-making has prepared for it. Power in the settled systems is maintained partly through the management of what its citizens fear and what they believe can be done about what they fear. The UC's greatest asset is the credible promise of protection. When the creature at the center of that promise turns out to be one whose spread was accelerated by the UC's own wartime decisions, whose life cycle was suppressed by a UC Admiral, whose natural predator was culled at a UC supply hub, the promise does not break loudly. It simply becomes, in quiet ways, harder to keep. And in the silence around that difficulty, people keep dying in places far enough from the center that the death doesn't register as a political event until it registers as a symbol. There is a moment in the investigation of the Terrormorph threat where something shifts, not dramatically, not in the way that moments shift in stories that announce their turning points. It shifts the way understanding shifts when you've been looking at something from one angle for a long time, and then, almost by accident, find the angle where it finally makes sense. That shift is the moment you realize that this has always been two wars simultaneously. The first war, the one everyone knows about, involves weapons and vanguard patrols and colony defenses and extraordinary human courage in the face of something genuinely terrifying. The second war is quieter and has been running longer. It is the war for the meaning of what Terrormorphs are. For the story, the UC tells about them, and for the story, it doesn't tell. The management of the heatleech life cycle as classified knowledge for over a century. The management of Sanon's survival as a state secret. The management of the Aceles role as something to be addressed going forward, rather than something to be accounted for in the past. These are not separate from the Terrormorph crisis. They are its infrastructure. Because the creature is not the only thing that kills people. The story told about the creature also kills people. Settlers who didn't know that heatleeches could mature into Terrormorphs couldn't take precautions against heatleech infestation. Worlds that didn't know about the Lazarus plant's accelerant effect couldn't prepare for the speed of the transformation. Communities that were never told that their government's wartime food choices had compromised the ecological check on this threat couldn't make informed decisions about where to settle or how, or with what resources they should have been provided. Information withheld has consequences as real as any physical attack. The UC's most significant failure in this story is epistemic. It is the failure, compounded over decades, to allow the people most at risk to understand the nature of the risk they faced. And that failure did not originate with any single decision. It originated in a culture that treats knowledge as an asset to be managed, rather than a protection to be distributed. Vae Victis is the sharpest point of this, the figure who personifies the worst of what that culture produces. A man who knew the mechanism of a mass killing, kept it to justify a decision he had already made, and then, decades later, weaponized that same knowledge from a cell that his government had provided him in exchange for continued usefulness. He is the endpoint of the logic of institutional utility, the place you arrive when you have, for long enough, treated the management of inconvenient truth as a form of power. But Hadrian is the other endpoint, the scientist who spent her career trying to understand the creature her progenitor helped loose on the world, who didn't know who he was or what he had done, who was trying, with insufficient information and insufficient institutional support, in the ruins of a city built to process the predator whose absence made her work necessary, to find a way to make things better. She is what the system produces when it works against itself, when the cover-up is so total that even the person best positioned to understand the damage is kept from the information that would tell her how deep it goes. The choice between Aceles and Microbe is the last act of that story, not because it resolves the question of accountability, it doesn't, but because it is the moment where the investigation becomes something more than an investigation. It is the moment where you decide what kind of future you're building with the knowledge you've recovered, whether the restoration of something lost is part of that future, or whether the answer is to make something new and move on. Somewhere on Toliman II, there are ruins buried in ice and snow. Not the dramatic ruins of a battle, not craters and collapsed fortifications, but the quieter, sadder ruins of stopped life. Buildings that were halfway through being built. A community that had not yet accumulated the kind of physical permanence that makes a place look like it was always there, because it never got the chance. Londinion was not a symbol when it was alive. It was a place where people got up in the morning and had opinions about the food dispensers and made plans that extended years into a future they fully expected to inhabit. The ruins preserve a particular kind of incompleteness, the shape of what was stopped, held in ice, waiting. Forward Base 441 monitors the ruins now, a small UC military outpost on the outskirts of what was once a colony, watching for Terrormorph activity, warning travelers away from a restricted zone that still hasn't been fully cleared after all these years. The institutions that hold responsibility for those ruins have not been held accountable in any straightforward sense. The UC has mourned Londinion, formally and repeatedly. It has placed the event in the category of tragedies to be acknowledged, honored, and, carefully, not examined. There is a difference between an event that generates grief and an event that generates reform, and that difference is usually found in whether the people with the power to prevent the event are the same people with the power to define what it meant. In the case of Londinion, they are, and the definition has been, correspondingly, one that mourns without implicating. The secret war against Terrormorphs is not really over. The heatleech life cycle is now publicly known. The investigation of 2033 saw to that. The Lazarus plant's role in accelerating transformation has been revealed, and the UC cabinet has committed to securing the plant and ensuring it cannot be weaponized again. And Vae Victis has faced, or will face, some form of final reckoning, depending on what the player chose to do with the truth they recovered. These are not small things. The architecture of the cover-up has been exposed, at least in part. But the Aceles are still nearly extinct. The heatleeches are still in the cargo holds of ships crossing the settled systems. The ecosystems of dozens of frontier worlds still carry the consequences of decisions made during the colony war. And the institutional culture that treated knowledge about a mortal threat as something to be managed rather than distributed. That culture exists beyond any individual admiral's crimes, in the protocols and priorities of an organization that still runs the inner systems and still extends its reach into the frontier. What the Terrormorphs are in the end is a question the settled systems have not yet fully answered. They are a creature of extraordinary lethality, shaped by evolution or chance into something that pushes human defensive capacity to its limits. They are the adult form of a pest so common it barely registered as a threat, spread across the galaxy in the cargo holds of the ships that built human civilization here. They are the consequence of a war that ate the one thing capable of keeping them in check. And they are the instrument of a man who understood all of this, kept it, and decided that what he knew was worth more to him as a secret than as a protection. All of these things are true simultaneously. None of them cancels any of the others. The creature is real. The devastation is real. The grief of everyone who lost someone to this threat is real and does not require any revelation to be valid. But underneath the reality of the threat runs the quieter reality of the response to it, the choices made in wartime that stripped an ecosystem of its balance, the knowledge kept that might have saved lives. The Admiral kept alive in a basement because he was too useful to actually execute, the cover maintained not by dramatic villainy, but by the ordinary institutional preference for a manageable story over an inconvenient truth. The ruins on Toliman II don't ask for acknowledgement. They simply exist, buried in ice, in a part of space that most people will never visit. And the question they represent, not only what happened, but what was known, and when, and by whom, and what was decided about who got to know it, keeps waiting with the particular patience of things that haven't been answered, for the kind of reckoning that powerful institutions almost never provide on their own. Maybe that reckoning comes from the outside, from the investigators, from the people willing to sit with the emergency recordings and the xenobiological research and the space between what was filed and what was followed up, from the ones who understand that the dead deserve not just symbols, but the honest account of what made their deaths possible. The archive is vast. The silence between its entries is where the most important things live. Stay with it long enough, and the shape of what was hidden becomes visible, not all at once, not neatly, but in the way that all true things eventually become visible to someone who refuses to stop looking. That's what we're here to do.